The history of the mountain men is filled with stories of men who survived against all odds. Join History at the OK Corral as we examine 5 of the most brutal survival stories in the history of the American mountain men. Eastern Idaho, 1832. As bullets whiz by them and the sounds of gunshots fill the air, a group of Blackfoot warriors urge their galloping horses towards a small lake ensconced in the mountainous terrain. Behind them, in hot pursuit, ride several American fur trappers, firing their single-shot rifles and pistols to the best of their abilities while riding atop their galloping mounts. With little option in the way of escape, the small group of Blackfoot warriors take to the frigid waters of the small lake. Here, with their horses in water up to their withers, the warriors now launch arrows towards their attackers. The fur trappers in hot pursuit are momentarily stalled, not wanting to risk bogging their horses down in the water by furthering their attack. They retreat to a position on the banks of the small body of water under cover of the area's abundant timber. From here, they trade shots with the waterlogged Blackfoot, assuming their quarry to be trapped and all but assuredly doomed. But this Blackfoot hunting party the trappers have happened upon are in fact only one small part of a larger band of Blackfoot camped only a few miles away. When one warrior on a particularly fleet pony makes his way back to their village, reinforcements are quickly gathered, and in mere minutes, a force of hundreds of Blackfoot warriors are mounted and charging out of the camp towards their brethren who are trapped in the waters of the lake. Soon, it is the American fur trappers who are on the defensive, as the newly arrived Blackfoot reinforcements pour over the hilltop behind them. At the head of the attack is a Blackfoot chief named Eagle Ribs. He is a member of the Buffalo Society and among the very few warriors allowed to wear the horns of the buffalo as a headdress. He rides in front of his warriors, all among them incensed at the trappers' attack. In the preceding few months, the Blackfoot had killed numerous fur trappers in the area, along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers. They are, without question, the most feared tribe among the trappers here on the northern plains. The Blackfoot are a powerful warrior tribe, the ruling power here on the northern plains, a title they have earned through years of ruthless expansion after the introduction of the horse to their people sometime in the 17th century led to a veritable explosion in capabilities in both hunting and raiding. Now, as they turn the tide of the trappers' attack, a shudder flows down the spines of the once bellicose mountain men, as all among them know that, while being killed by the Blackfoot will surely be a terrifying end, it will pale in comparison to the agonies that await them should they be taken alive. Now, under a hail of arrows and bullets, the trappers are forced to retreat from their position, abandoning their attack and riding back towards their own camp several miles away. Just minutes prior to their arrival, the camp had been a typical scene of activities, with men carrying out chores, repairing equipment, and checking their inventories. But as the first riders fleeing the Blackfoot race into camp, the routine of the morning is quickly broken, and it is readily apparent to the trappers that they will now have to take immediate action in a fight for their lives. Now, the men amongst the trappers' forces will soon face the full might of the Blackfoot's martial prowess brought to bear on them here in the middle of the wilds of the Idaho mountains. Among the trappers is 28-year-old Jim Bridger, one of the most experienced among them, and for all intents and purposes, their elected leader. Bridger has seen more of the American West than most living men. Born James Felix Bridger in Richmond, Virginia in 1804, Bridger had come west like so many countless other American young men in the early 19th century, in search of adventure and fortune. As a teenage neophyte to the frontier, on his first trapping expedition, Bridger had been part of the seminal Ashley's 100 fur trapping expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1823. While on this initial foray into the world of the mountain men, Bridger had been one of the 2 men charged with remaining with Hugh Glass after his now infamous misfortune of being severely mauled by a mother grizzly in present-day South Dakota. Glass, a legendary trapper in his own right, and already a noted veteran by the time Jim Bridger arrived on the frontier, had been so badly wounded that his comrades, unable and unwilling to linger in a dangerous hostile native territory for what they saw as an exercise in futility, had left Bridger and another trapper named John Fitzgerald to remain with Glass until he inevitably expired from his wounds. But as Bridger and Fitzgerald fretfully waited hour after hour in the frigid, dangerous territory for their comrade to finally succumb to his condition, he proved amazingly and frustratingly resilient. Though he appeared to continue to decline, Glass simply refused to die. After their nerves had been sufficiently rattled by the prospect of being captured alive by hostile natives, they had weighed their options and chose, regrettably, to leave Glass to his seemingly inevitable fate. They had eventually made their way back to civilization, where the young Bridger had joined up with another fur company, and Fitzgerald had gone on to join the army. But Hugh Glass did not die. Instead, in a feat that is now etched in the annals of frontier legend, he managed to survive and effectively drag himself hundreds of miles to the nearest fort, where his wounds were treated and his life miraculously saved. Once recovered, Glass had eventually sought revenge on Bridger and Fitzgerald, but found Fitzgerald now under the protection of the U.S. Army and Bridger to be just a teenage boy. He ultimately forgave the youngster and Fitzgerald out of the charity of his own heart. Despite this relatively inauspicious start, Bridger would remain undaunted in his pursuit of life as a mountain man. In the fall of 1824, he would become one of the first white men to explore the Yellowstone region of present-day northwestern Wyoming. Here, he was one of the first Americans to lay eyes on the parting of the waters at Yellowstone Lake. In 1830, he was part of a group that bought out the legendary Jedediah Smith's stake in what would come to be known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a trapping outfit composed of several members of Ashley's 100 who sought to contest the powerful John Jacob Astor's monopolist American Fur Company. By 1834, however, with the decline of the beaver population and growing difficulty in turning a profit in the fur trade, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was bought out by the American Fur Company and absorbed into Astor's corporate structure. In 1835, Bridger had married a woman named Emma from the Flathead tribe, a people who resided in the ranges of what is today western Montana and eastern Idaho. The couple would ultimately have 3 children together, necessitating, or perhaps excusing, Bridger's constant excursions with fur trapping companies into increasingly less profitable and increasingly dangerous territories. In this year of 1836, Bridger and his troop of fur trappers are on their way to the yearly rendezvous that will be held in present-day Idaho at a place called Pierre's Hole. The rendezvous is an annual tradition amongst the mountain men and local tribes, one that affords all a brief, fleeting respite from the drudgeries and dangers of life on the frontier. The furs and hides that had been so arduously gotten in the preceding year would be traded and sold. Goods and supplies would be bought and bartered for, and all could partake in the ample good food and drink. Songs, dances, gambling, gossip, as well as romantic liaisons between lonely mountain men and native women, all abounded. Though not the debauched and overtly drunken scene that is often portrayed, the yearly rendezvous was a lively and exciting affair. Bridger, as well as the rest of the mountain men in camp, had long looked forward to the affair, and now, with the rendezvous only days away, it had briefly seemed to all that they could almost taste the flowing hard cider and freshly baked breads. However, now, any thoughts of rest and recreation are quickly dashed as the influx of their comrades riding at full speed pours into the camp. The cry of "Blackfoot" quickly spreads throughout the camp, and now Jim Bridger and the rest of the trappers scramble to their single-shot rifles and make ready for the fight to come. The trappers take their positions in a loose battle line facing the direction of the approaching Blackfoot, and, for a few eerie moments, they can only hear the thundering hooves and war whoops of the warriors rapidly closing in to make their attack. Then, suddenly, the war party crests the top of the hill overlooking the campsite. Seeing the defensive line of mountain men protecting the camp, the Blackfoot pause atop the hill, just outside of rifle range. For a harrowing few minutes, a nervous tension permeates the air, as both parties warily appraise the size and strength of their opponent's forces. However, as the nervous trappers eye the sizable war party atop the hill in front of them, one amongst their party carefully and excitedly searches the lines of the mounted warriors, hoping to see a familiar face. She is the wife of one of the trappers, a Mexican man named Loretto, who had bartered for her freedom a number of years earlier after finding her as a prisoner of the Crow. She is, in fact, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Though taken from her people as a young woman, she is intimately familiar with Blackfoot culture and customs, and, having not visited this territory for several years, might very possibly be a long-lost relative or friend to the attacking Blackfoot. While she finds no comfort in searching for a familiar face, what happens next brings a brief glimmer of hope to herself and all amongst the trappers. Calmly and coolly from atop the hill, Chief Eagle-Ribs now rides forward with a small group of warriors, bearing a pipe of peace and gesturing for the trappers to send a group of their own to discuss peace negotiations. Now, Jim Bridger enlists the help of the Blackfoot woman to act as an interpreter, and Bridger, the woman, and a small group of trappers now make their way towards the expanse between the two lines, all the while wary of a surprise attack from the Blackfoot. As an off-putting silence overtakes the battlefield, it seems to many present that all that can be heard is the plodding of the two parties' horses towards one another. As he rides in front of his group, Bridger begins to scan the line of Blackfoot warriors to the rear of Eagle-Ribs and his contingent, growing increasingly concerned as he nears the spot where the proposed negotiations are to take place. In only a precious few seconds, his suspicions overtake him, and as he, the other trappers, and the Blackfoot woman are mere yards away from Chief Eagle-Ribs and his men, with the chief now extending his hand in a gesture of peace, Bridger attempts to quietly pull back the hammer on his single-shot rifle. But in the tense silence that has befallen the would-be battlefield, the minute action resounds with a voluminous click, audible to all of those present, especially to Chief Eagle-Ribs. The Blackfoot chief instantly grabs the barrel of Bridger's rifle and thrusts it towards the ground. As he does so, Bridger attempts to pull the trigger and shoot the chief, but his bullet merely fires harmlessly into the dirt. Now, a violent struggle ensues between Bridger and Chief Eagle-Ribs, and within moments, the entirety of both parties, with the exception of the Blackfoot woman, are in a full-pitched fight. As Bridger and the chief fight from atop their horses, another Blackfoot warrior sends an arrow whipping through the air and slamming into the small of Bridger's back. Moments later, a second arrow strikes just above the first, both projectiles embedding themselves deeply into the unfortunate man's torso. With Bridger now reeling in pain, Eagle-Ribs now seizes the rifle from his hands and strikes Bridger from his horse with a powerful blow that Bridger at first assumes to have broken his neck. For her part, the Blackfoot woman takes this opportunity to flee back to the lines of the trappers and her husband and infant child. The Blackfoot warriors, however, quickly thwart her escape, cutting off her path and driving her back towards the Blackfoot. The distressed young mother now becomes irate, screaming inconsolably to be allowed to return to her child. The Blackfoot at first appear unmoved, but after recognizing her as a member of their own people, Chief Eagle-Ribs instructs the young woman to call out to her husband and ask him to bring the child to her. He assures her that her husband and child will not be harmed. Minutes later, the nervous young father plods cautiously across the veritable no-man's land that lies between the trappers' lines and the Blackfoot. He assumes that he will likely be killed as soon as he reaches the Blackfoot, but drives himself on in hopes of at least delivering the child to her mother. To his surprise, he arrives at the Blackfoot lines unharmed and is allowed to hand the child over to his wife. However, this is where the charity of Eagle-Ribs and his warriors has been exhausted. The man is instructed to now leave his wife and child and return to the trappers. He is promised that he will be left unharmed as he crosses and that his wife and child will be cared for. The unnerved trapper now makes his way, again, across the expanse of mountainous prairie, feverishly wondering if he has seen his young family for the last time. For the time being, it appears that he has, as the Blackfoot now take their newly returned tribal sister and her child with them as they sink over the hills and into the wilderness. The befuddled, heartbroken young father can only watch on. Meanwhile, though the Blackfoot have now left the battlefield, Jim Bridger's troubles have only begun, as the 2 arrows lodged deeply in his lower back now cause him excruciating pain with even the slightest movement. As his blood-soaked shirt is cut away, it is apparent to his attending brethren that extracting the arrows will be a difficult, painful process. While one of the arrows is pried free with relative ease, the second remains lodged immovably. The arrows employed by this band of Blackfoot are steel-tipped, acquired from trade with the British. Unlike their stone predecessors, these tips do not break or shatter, but bend and hook upon impact, making the extraction of a warped arrowhead all but impossible. After several excruciating attempts, the decision is made that the arrowhead will have to be left. The mountain men present, acting as rudimentary though serviceable physicians considering the circumstances, agree that any further surgical incursion into the wound by their untrained hands will only cause more damage. And so, the bent steel arrowhead is left where it has struck, embedded in the soft tissue of Jim Bridger's lower back. In this pitiable condition, Bridger is now forced to endure the agonizing ride to the rendezvous. The long-awaited trip is all but spoiled for the young mountain man, as his pride is also significantly wounded, having suffered not only the arrow wounds, but the theft of his rifle by the Blackfoot chief Eagle Ribs. Though Bridger is able to turn a substantial profit for his year's worth of trapping, the limitations of his condition only serve to dampen his spirits. But this will not be the last time that the legendary Jim Bridger will meet with the feared and fearsome Blackfoot. Though he will carry the arrowhead in his back for the remainder of his life, Bridger will return to the frontier in only a matter of weeks, and over the course of the succeeding years, he and his trapper cohorts will meet the Blackfoot in countless brutal confrontations in the fight to control the northern plains. But the many stories of the fabled life of Jim Bridger, as well as the countless instances of heroism, ferocity, selflessness, and tragedy that will occur in the battles between the mountain men and the Blackfoot in the years to come, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. South Dakota, June 1823. On the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extends to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moves warily alongside a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They are hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in territory that does not belong to them. They are a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds and ethnicities, dressed in a menagerie of wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon skin caps, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, is money, made by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that makes the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. Their methods are simple. Set traps for the beavers, after which the animals will become ensnared in the traps and drown. Then, the trappers will return to collect the beaver pelts and repeat this process until the beaver population has been exhausted, before finally moving on. But, in this case, simple does not equal easy. Opposing them are the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Animal attacks, from the numerous grizzly bears which prowl the continent, to rattlesnakes, to buffalo stampedes, pose an ever-present threat. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche have, already, in these early years of the fur trade, killed many trappers in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territorial bounds. Among this party of men are some who will go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They are commanded by William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks are Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, all men whose future exploits will become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith is an anomaly amongst this already anomalous lot, as he is a devout Methodist, reads the Bible daily, and refrains from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he is approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to Ashley's fort, aptly known as Fort Ashley. He is to inform Ashley that the company is in need of more horses and that the Arikara tribe will likely be the closest people with which to trade in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith is still a relative neophyte to the world of trapping, but he is a man on the rise within the ranks of his company, as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy companion grows by the day. And so, Smith sets out to the south, and is fortuitously met by Ashley on the trail. The pair then proceed to the Arikara village, where they seek to buy more horses. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known both for their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, are in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men have guns and ammunition that the Arikara know they can acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there is a terse and tense peace, as often happens in these instances on the frontier. In the wilds of North America, native tribes and fur trappers are not necessarily antagonistic. In fact, sometimes the case can be quite the opposite. For centuries in colonial America and Canada, native tribes had been employed by large fur company magnates to supply them with the highly profitable furs of the deer, mink, otter, and beaver that had profligated their homeland. However, as game populations began to dwindle, the fur companies eventually brought their search for pelts to the expanses of the North American prairies and Rocky Mountains. The tribes who inhabited these lands oftentimes expressed little to no interest in working for fiat currency or goods when their lifestyles and economies were focused on hunting the immense herds of American bison that populated the plains. Thus, in the spirit of their predecessors in men like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, who were known as long hunters, the fur companies have scoured the outlying cities of the frontier, offering gainful employment to any man with the gumption and skills to venture onto the inhospitable frontier to procure the valuable fur of the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers and streams that crisscrossed the continent. Still, fur companies routinely employ native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers. Many of the early mountain men owe their skills to lessons learned from their native guides. Even in the 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed entirely in a vacuum. This could be seen not only in the dress of both native trappers and tribes, who often traded in various garb such as jewelry made from beads from China, hats made in factories on the eastern seaboard, and buffalo robes harvested and carefully prepared in centuries-old fashion by native tribeswomen. While tools such as firearms indeed proved invaluable to the native tribes, so too did steel tools and implements such as axes, knives, and cooking utensils. Thus, a robust trade between the fur-trapping companies and the inhabiting tribes of the northern plains has been a mainstay for years, even in the 1820s. At the Arikara village, initial dealings are made between Smith, Ashley, and the Arikara. As the sun begins to set, it is mutually agreed that trading will continue the following day. Ashley splits his forces into two, leaving one on land to guard the supplies they had brought out from the boats, and the other to man the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards from the banks of the river. It is decided that Ashley will be in direct command of the boats, and Smith will be in charge of the force guarding the supplies. Now, nearly all of the mountain men present go about their nightly duty of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all have finally bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain man's party sneak into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hope to trade for illicit relations with the Arikara women. This proves to be a fatal mistake. Just after midnight, Colonel Ashley is awakened by 3 Arikara warriors who have snuck onto the boat and are attempting to loot its cargo. He brandishes his pistol and chases them off the boat. But just as the Arikara make it to the shore, and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes goes quiet, it is suddenly replaced by the frantic screams of one of the 2 mountain men who have snuck into the Arikara camp. He and his companion had indeed found the Arikara women they were hoping to, but they had also found the Arikara men, who were not happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. His companion has been cut down where he was found. The surviving trapper, a man named Edward Rose, has escaped and now appears on the banks of the river, making his way, as fast as he can, for the trapper's camp on shore. As he runs, he screams that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, is dead, and the Arikara are now in a collectively angry mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now enraged Arikara, the mountain men begin to hurriedly and vociferously debate their options. Some argue for immediately moving the horses they have, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun does come up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argue for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carry on, a lone Arikara suddenly appears on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he calls out that he will try to broker a deal for the return of their comrade's body, for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agree to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returns to inform them that unfortunately he will not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body has in fact been so badly mutilated that there is nothing left to return to them. This, understandably, sends a cold chill through the ranks of the shore party. It is decided that they will now have to move the horses as quickly as possible as the sunrise nears with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraces his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directs the movement of the horses across the river. However, as the sun begins to rise and a large number of horses and men are still mid-river or on the near bank waiting their turn, the mountain men are greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight are hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping shot down into their muskets, knocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation is now painfully apparent to everyone present. They are stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows begin to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a number of trappers fall dead in the initial volley, with many others gravely wounded. The screams of the injured and dying men and horses fills the air, as Ashley and the men on the boats attempt to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The men on the boats provide what covering fire they can, and the men on shore take cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigns all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doles out directions to those in his charge. As he and his men fire and reload, they simultaneously make strategic retreats, moving by leapfrogging from one defensive position to the next until reaching the comparative safety of the boats. Amidst all of this, Ashley's boat has run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this same time, cuts ties to their anchor and begins moving downstream in an attempt to at least save themselves from this seemingly hopeless situation. Ashley's boat is quickly freed and makes its way as close to the shore as possible. Smith and his men finally reach the banks of the river, dive in, and begin to frantically swim. Some are hit by arrows and musket balls and sink under the surface, never to be seen again. Some are swept downriver beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it onto the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, now hunker down and return fire as the boats make their way as quickly as possible down the Missouri River and out of range of Arikara musket and arrow fire. For some of these men, this will be the end of their mountain man adventures. Those who decide they have had enough of this wild and dangerous life are put on boats back to St. Louis, along with their injured and recovering comrades. No one blames them for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life is all too often short and seemingly cheap. But the careers of William Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith are far from over. One incident immediately following the battle speaks to the human cost of this attack that will be felt by families scattered all over the American states back east. Hugh Glass himself will go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The letter reads, "Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son, who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot, and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship, where he soon died. Mr. Jedediah Smith, young man of our company, made a powerful prayer, which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp, and marked the graves with a log. His things we send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass." This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, as well as his anger towards the Arikara, but it is the first mention of the piety and character of Jedediah Smith. Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in the hopes of mounting an even larger retributive force to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man in history. But the many stories of the legendary exploits of Hugh Glass, William Ashley, and Jedediah Smith are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, 1836. In the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, a young fur trapper named Isaac P. Rose shakes himself free from the warmth of the buffalo robe he has been sleeping in and rises to his feet. In a daze, the man wanders into the freezing, ominous darkness of the woods that surround his and his companion's small campsite. He trudges to a spot a few dozen yards away, feeling inextricably drawn to a small clearing just beyond the tree line. As he comes into view of the clearing, he is shocked to see the hulking figure of a lone grizzly bear. For the veteran mountain man, the sight of a grizzly bear here in the wilds near Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River is not at all unusual. However, this grizzly is standing on his hind legs, nearly 8 feet tall, and staring intently at the bewildered man. Locking eyes with Rose, the bear walks up to the man, striding in an eerily human-like gait, and speaks. He tells Rose, in a deep, steady voice, to shake his hand. Rose, more confused than afraid, offers the hulking beast his left hand. The bear refuses to take it. Rose, sensing the animal's offense, hurriedly extends his right hand instead. At this, the bear silently and solemnly shakes the man's hand with both of his massive paws. Then, the bear suddenly disappears with a gust of icy wind. Just as suddenly, Rose finds himself awakened by the morning sun, still wrapped in the warm buffalo blanket. It had all, of course, been a dream. Rose and his fellow mountain men, a party composed of himself, as well as Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Heed, have departed from their main company to procure meat for their starving comrades. The main party, under the leadership of the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger, are camped 30 miles away. They are counting on Rose and their other comrades to ease the troublesome burden of surviving the harsh winter at hand. They have thus far been successful, as they have managed to kill so many buffalo that, after one day's hunt, 4 of the 8 horses that have been brought along to pack the meat now find themselves burdened by full loads. The snow is deep, and travel has been slow. With another long, cold day ahead of them, the 4 trappers begin to pack their things and make ready for travel. As they do this, Rose recounts his strange dream to his companions, partly for their amusement, and partly hoping one of them might proffer an explanation as to the meaning of it. He tells them how Caleb, the colloquial name amongst the mountain men for the grizzly bear, had come to him in a dream, that he had spoken and only shaken his right hand. Joe Meek, another veteran trapper, shakes his head and lowers his concerned eyes on Rose. "You better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Beelzebub before night." While the grizzly bear certainly instills a healthy sense of respect and fear in any mountain man, what they fear most is coming into contact with Beelzebub. Though this name is used in the New Testament for the devil, that is not the image that comes to the typical trapper's mind when they hear the word. For these men, the most fearful entity that they might encounter here in the wilds, thousands of miles from their places of birth, is not the grizzly, nor is it the venomous snakes, nor buffalo stampedes, wolves, mountain lions, flash floods, avalanches, or wildfires. For the mountain men, their greatest fear is the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, or Siksika, had originated in the northeast, near the area between modern-day Maine and Canada. They would eventually make their way to the Great Lakes region, and then, even further west, to the expanses of the plains of present-day Alberta, Canada, and the state of Montana. They had subsisted in these unforgiving environs for centuries as foot-bound hunters. Before the introduction of the horse into the Blackfoot culture in the 18th century, they had survived by chasing buffalo herds off of cliffs, gathering at the bottom to butcher the animals. Their cultural transformation to a horse-based people who hunted, conducted warfare, and traveled on horseback was delayed far longer than tribes further south. This was due more to geography than anything else, as the Blackfoot's northerly location placed them farther away from the large populations of horses found in Mexico and Texas. But, however forestalled their transformation might have been, it had also been incredibly rapid and incredibly consequential on the northern plains. The Blackfoot had quickly mastered hunting and fighting from atop charging mounts and had proven the most formidable power in the area for decades by the time Isaac Rose and his comrades ventured into their territory in the 1830s. During the winter months, which can often amount to more than half the year in these northernmost reaches of the Great Plains, the Blackfoot set up their villages in wooded river valleys. On the rare occasion that they venture out from these quarters, it is generally to partake in the same practice as Rose and his companions. They hunt the buffalo herds that hunker down in wooded areas and harvest as many as they can carry back in order to sustain their families and community until the long-awaited end of winter. For their part, the buffalo are more than simply a main food source of the Blackfoot. For the Blackfoot, nearly every tool and furnishing at their disposal comes, in some form or fashion, from the buffalo. Properly known as the American bison or plains bison, they are the largest animal on the North American continent. The largest males can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds and be incredibly unpredictable. They roam virtually the entirety of the middle of the continent, from northern Canada to Mexico, in what is known as the Bison Belt. At their peak, most experts estimate their population to range from 30 to 50 million, with some estimates being as high as 75 million. Their thick hides provide the material with which the Blackfoot and other plains tribes construct their teepees. Their bones, hooves, and horns are used to construct tools and cooking utensils. Bison meat is, of course, the basis of the Blackfoot diet. Roasted, fried, boiled, dried, or raw, it can be prepared and consumed in a variety of manners. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo are a sacred gift from their creator, one meant to sustain their way of life and livelihood. As such, they see fit to protect their resources by any means necessary. Since the buffalo herds are such an important resource for the Blackfoot, any incursion into their territory, and especially any hunting of the buffalo on that territory, is seen as an offense punishable by death. Hugh Monroe, a Canadian fur trapper who was adopted into the Blackfoot, gives his account of how viciously the Blackfoot dealt with intruders, even of other native tribes. After finding a still smoldering campfire of a neighboring tribe referred to as the River People, The Blackfoot whom Monroe was living with became inconsolably irate and set on revenge. He asked one warrior, a man named Lone Walker, what had happened. Monroe's account is as follows. "The campers here were river people," said Lone Walker. "We have forbidden them to come over here to our plains, but they keep coming and stealing our buffaloes. We shall now make them cry." "You are going to fight them?" asked Monroe. "Yes," said Lone Walker. "I shivered," recalls Monroe. "In my mind's eye, I saw a great battle of arrows flying and guns booming, and men falling and crying out in their death and agony. And for what? Just a few buffalo that blackened the plains? Don't fight," pleaded Monroe. "There are plenty of buffaloes. Let the river people go in peace with what they have killed." "But," the Canadian recalled, "he gave me no answer other than a grim smile, and rode out to meet the head of the Blackfoot column. In the ensuing fight, the Blackfoot would kill 7 of the river people's warriors, as their women and children fled in a desperate panic. All 7 dead warriors would be scalped and otherwise mutilated, as equal parts punishment and warning. Afterwards, a great celebration was held. In their present circumstances, Rose and his fellow trappers are, of course, well aware of the danger their venture has placed them in. However, they are also aware that the buffalo meat they return to their company with could quite literally be the difference between a relatively comfortable winter and possibly starving to death in the middle of nowhere. And so now, for the time being, they are not dissuaded from their job at hand. The 4 men plan to continue on with their day, spending it much the same as they had the day before. Rose, the most reliable shot, would fall a buffalo, and then they would all set into quartering and packing the meat. However, after seeing several hundred of the animals, they have proven so unusually skittish that Rose cannot get close enough to get off a shot. This suspicious behavior spells only one sure thing, according to the veteran mountain man's instincts, that the Blackfoot are nearby. The trappers agree that their best course of action is to return to the camp with the buffalo meat they have been able to procure so far. They head southeast through rolling hills. As the men ride, conversation is kept to a minimum, and their eyes continually scan the landscape around them. They all know that being caught with a bounty of buffalo meat will likely spell a torturous end at the hands of the Blackfoot. This end could certainly come via a variety of tortures routinely employed by almost all Plains tribes. These included being staked out in the summer sun, burned under red-hot coals, or quite literally being carved to pieces as their torturers, along with the women and children of the tribe, laugh at and chide them. But a hard death could also, as Rose and company had found out only weeks earlier, be suffered even after escaping a Blackfoot attack. A Delaware tribesman named Manhead, who had been traveling with the fur company, had been out hunting with Rose when the pair were suddenly attacked by a small group of Blackfoot warriors. Rose and Manhead had managed to make it back to camp, with Manhead suffering only a flesh wound from a bullet in his calf. But as soon as they reached camp, Manhead informed Rose that he had been hit with a dreaded poison bullet, and his demise was all but certain. Over the succeeding hours, the unfortunate Delaware would suffer an agonizing death. In his biographical work on Isaac Rose titled 4 Years in the Rockies, author James B. Marsh addresses the reader directly in how these poison bullets were made. Perhaps our readers may not be fully aware of the method resorted to by the Indians to poison their bullets. It is done this way. A small piece of buffalo meat is placed on the end of a forked stick, and a rattlesnake is induced to strike it with his fangs. This poisoned meat is then dried, pounded into a powder, and placed in a small bag. When the Indian intends to use one of these poisoned bullets, he first puts it in his mouth and chews it for some time, then dips it into the bag, and the slightest wound from one of these bullets can cause death. As the trappers try to push these fears from their mind and focus on the task at hand, they feel an inexorable tension as the undulating terrain provides ample cover for a Blackfoot ambush. All they can hope for now is to make it back to their company's main camp and the comparative safety in numbers it provides. But after a few long hours of riding, it appears to the trappers as though they might actually make it to their destination unscathed. Then, just as they are about to reach a small ravine, a party of 8 Blackfoot spring up, screaming their defiant, powerful war cries. The lead Blackfoot warrior is scarcely 10 feet from Rose when the attack begins. Rose, in the lead, wheels his horse and is now the closest target for the Blackfoot to attack. Almost as suddenly as he can turn his horse to flee, the air is filled with the roar of gunfire, and Blackfoot musket balls whiz all around him. One of the balls passes through his cap, while another rips across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow cut across his skin and cutting the strings of his shot pouch, causing the critical piece of weaponry to fall to the ground. Another ball passes through the wrist of his buckskin glove, again miraculously only causing minor superficial damage to the wrist. Rose's most grievous wound comes when one of the lead balls smashes into his right elbow. The ball enters just above the joint and exits through the forearm, rendering the limb all but useless for the time being. The Blackfoot warrior nearest Rose, seeing he is now incapacitated, rides forward to finish the attack. The warrior attempts to grab Rose's horse by its bridle with one hand while attempting to shove Rose from the animal. Rose uses his severely injured right hand to hang on to the reins, while he repeatedly strikes the Blackfoot warrior in the face with his riding whip. As he does this, Rose's horse panics and lurches away from the Blackfoot, taking off in a dead run in the direction of the other trappers. This is a fortuitous break for the mountain man. However, as the horse wheels around to make their escape, Rose's rifle falls from his lap. He now realizes he is severely wounded and without any means of defense save for his hunting knife and tomahawk. His only remaining hope now is to hang on for dear life as his horse makes a mad dash away from the Blackfoot. Gritting his teeth, Rose urges the animal onward, doing all he can to hang on to the reins with his one working arm. Looking behind him, he sees the Blackfoot warrior closest in pursuit stop to pick up Rose's valuable rifle from the ground, fumbling with the rifle's leather scabbard. Rose again turns his gaze forward, hunkered down as low as possible next to his horse's neck. He then hears a sound he is well familiar with, the crack of his own rifle, followed by the sound of yet another musket ball whizzing by his head. Rose's charging steed manages to catch up to the party of 3 other trappers, whose retreat has been slowed by their heavily burdened pack animals. Seeing no better option, Jack Larison cuts the straps holding the loads to the animals, leaving hundreds of pounds of meat spilled upon the rolling prairie. Larison calls out to Rose, asking, "Are you killed, old boy?" "Not killed, but badly wounded," Rose replies. "Hurry forward, boys, and save yourselves if you can." Rose and his cohorts must now cover 30 miles of prairie in order to get back to the safety of their company. In a fortuitous break for the party, the Blackfoot have halted their pursuit in order to reclaim the buffalo meat that has been dropped by the trappers. Though they are now empty-handed, they are all alive. Rose, however, is beginning to rapidly decline over the course of the ride. His arm throbs in immense pain, and he is wrought with nausea and dizziness. For hours, he rides through icy winds and snow-covered grounds, his right arm dangling uselessly by his side. It is soon apparent that at least one of his wounds is the result of a poisoned bullet. As the trappers finally reach camp, it is readily apparent to all that Rose is on the verge of death. He is pulled off of his horse and carried into a tent, where Jim Bridger and a Delaware medicine man examine him. Both concur that he is the victim of a poisoned bullet, and that he has likely only survived this long due to the blood loss he has incurred during the ride. For the next few days, Rose lies in a tent, battling for his life against the effects of the poison and blood loss. His arm swells to a nearly unrecognizable mass, causing fissures in the skin at the shoulder. His nervous system becomes, in his own later words, fearfully disorganized. and even the slightest noise, light, or motion causes him great distress. His fellow trappers do all within their power to care for him, though little can be done other than keeping the wound clean and letting the man sleep as best he can. Most of his friends fear, if not outright assume, that he will not survive long. However, after about a week, the wound begins to heal. Soon, Rose is able to eat and walk, and, within a matter of only a few weeks, he is back to work, hunting and trapping. However, Rose will scarcely have regained the ability to hold down food by the time an injured scout comes riding into camp, seemingly in a full panic. The scout, a Mexican man known as Massacre, has been shot in the ankle, though thankfully not by a poisoned bullet, and has only escaped certain death at the hands of a roving Blackfoot band by hurling himself off of a steep cliff which they were not willing to follow him down. Massacre reports that the Blackfoot are coalescing in a winter camp on the Yellowstone River 4 miles to the south of the trappers' current location. The village is nearly 1,000 lodges strong, he says, and when they discover the trappers' location, the trappers will surely be wiped out. And so, the fight for the frontier will continue. Bridger will order his men to construct a makeshift fort, and the men to hunker down for what will be one of the most brutal encounters between native tribes and mountain men in the history of the Old West. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the countless other tales of conflict and coexistence between tribespeople and trappers, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine California horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his 2 comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more California soldiers coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a 3-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chamacta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pascual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary but deathly effective steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the California forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming California forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chimocta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the California sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chimocta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in their crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearny himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearny's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles, which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearny, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the California Lancer forces that stalked their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and California volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chimocta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andres Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andres Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el Lobo. The Wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chimocta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals would be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chimocta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the three men skulked through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chimocta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop, still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale, as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand, until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearny is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearny orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire! We're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. the spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules, will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle, and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort, make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. Got to San Diego the next night." In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the president. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California Gold Rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, "did not think that he could live," as well as maintain friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chamacta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of California rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Guerra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chamacta's band, the San Pasqual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California, is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pasqual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pasqual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But, though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
July 14th, 1828, southwestern Oregon. As the initial rays of sunlight struggled their way through the dense forest canopy in vaporous morning fog, finally reflecting on the rippling waters of the Umpqua River, a group of 4 men prepared to cast off in their dugout canoe. Their intention is to find a more passable route of travel rather than the circuitous, marshy path they had found themselves on in the last few days. 3 of the men are part of a 15 to 20 person band of fur trappers making their way north to Fort Vancouver in hopes of trading some of the fruits of their labors for some much-needed supplies, horses, and a respite from the omnipresent threats presented by the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. For them, the conditions presented by their current environs are at once shakingly unfamiliar and tranquilizingly routine. They had been making their way across the American West for the better part of 2 years, from St. Louis, across the Salt Lake Desert, the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevadas, and up from Southern California to Northern California, and then on to Oregon. They had seen all manner of hardships along the way, from grizzly attacks to hostile Mexican government officials to attacks from hostile native tribes. Less than a year earlier, some of these men had been among the few survivors to emerge from an attack by the Mojave tribe in the austere, Joshua tree-strewn desert that bears their name. They hailed from all manners of backgrounds and ethnicities, though most were American Protestants from states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and New York. Though their diversity in culture and experience makes their collective categorization all but impossible, it is safe to say that none among them had seen wilderness like what they had encountered in the previous few weeks. They had made their way up from the San Joaquin Valley in central California, northwest through giant redwoods to the northern California coast. They had hung close to the coastline, staying as close to the water as possible during the low tide and moving back up toward the timber as the water level necessitated. As they made their way north, they found the terrain and the native tribes less and less hospitable. The 4th man in their crew, though, felt right at home as they paddled up the frigid river lined with Oregon white oaks. He was a member of the Umpqua tribe, an umbrella group of several smaller subgroups, all of which had resided here in the Umpqua Valley for generations. Specifically, he was a member of the Lower Umpqua Band. The etymology of the word Umpqua is thought to trace back to a word from their neighbors to the south, the Tolowa tribe. It is theorized to mean a place along the river, or thundering water, or dancing water, or bring across the river. They spoke the Siuslaw language, lived in cedar plank houses, and survived by both hunting and fishing in forests, streams, and ocean inlets in their home territory. They were also, like most tribes in North America at this point, increasingly impacted and influenced by the encroachment of Europeans and North Americans in their homelands. Like most tribes along the northern California and southern Oregon coastal ranges, the Umpqua were not averse to violent retaliation in response to trespassing in their territory. But they were not averse to making their lives easier either. However masterful the Umpqua, and for that matter any native tribe, may have been as woodsmen, life for them was still incredibly difficult. Not only was hunting made easier with firearms, but cleaning and dressing the animal were often easier with steel knives than with stone tools. Falling trees and splitting firewood was a far less laborious task when using a steel axe obtained from the whites. Though beads made from seashells and bones were indeed beautiful, the glass beads from the European and American traders could be garnered in a wider array of colors and a far greater quantity. Medicines, foodstuffs, blankets, fabrics, and gunsmithing services were all highly valued goods and services that most tribes could procure through few, if any, other sources than via trading with the whites. This led to an unavoidable mixing of cultures and a variety of cultural, economic, and military alliances. Though clashes were frequent throughout the West, as had been the case for the trapping party in the preceding weeks, The prevailing rule was that the enemy of one's enemy was one's friend. Many in the modern world often create a fundamental false binary of simply whites versus natives, when this does a fundamental disservice to both groups. The native tribes from Alaska to Argentina lived in harsh, conflict-ridden worlds in which life was a constant struggle for resources and safety. Just as in the modern world, pragmatism often won out over cultural purity in the interest of survival. Though this party of mountain men were clearly and presently trespassers in Umpqua territory, they could perhaps serve more utility as allies than enemies, or so the Umpqua had initially thought. And, for their part, nothing would have made the mountain men happier. Though many among them were certainly partial to the ardent nationalism of the early 19th century, almost all were cultural and economic pragmatists, first and foremost. Their goal was not to acquire territory, nor to entice the native tribes into a fight. Quite the contrary, their endeavors were essentially purely economic in nature, and thus many mountain men prided themselves on their ability to navigate the turbulent waters between such wildly different cultures. This was especially true for the leader of this party, the young but already legendary Jedediah Smith. Though he was only 29 years old, he had already spent a decade of his life in the wilds of the American West. He had been born in 1799 in what is today Bainbridge, New York, to Jedediah Smith Sr. and Sally Strong, longtime New Englanders of staunch, puritanical stock. The family moved to Erie County, Pennsylvania when Smith was still a boy, and by age 13, his innate thirst for adventure led him to find a job as a clerk on a Lake Erie freighter. Here, he came across a number of frontiersmen and fur trappers, many under the employ of the Hudson Bay Company. Thoroughly regaled with tales of daring, adventure, and riches had from capitalizing on Europe's obsessive demand for New World furs, Smith set out for St. Louis at the age of 17, and by 1822, census information shows him living in the burgeoning, though doubtless still austere, frontier city. Here, his hopes of obtaining employment with a fur company expedition were realized when he, along with 99 other adventure-hungry young men, answered a newspaper ad in the Missouri Gazette. The ad was posted by General William H. Ashley, another eventually legendary figure in the history of the mountain men and fur trade in the American West. General Ashley called for 100 enterprising young men to head northwest to the Rockies in search of beaver pelts that were used to make the hats now so in vogue in London taverns and Paris cafes. In the spring of 1823, the company, known to history as Ashley's 100, left St. Louis, and Jedediah left his old life behind forever. He had risen quickly through the loose commandatory hierarchy of the fur trapping companies, comporting himself with courage and composition, time and again, under the duress of frustration, starvation, thirst, and combat. He had seen countless close friends die in violent ways, endured seemingly endless travel and privation, and seen his boyish good looks scarred forever after narrowly surviving an attack from a grizzly bear. Through it all, Smith had been noted for his moderation, his piety, his reliability, and his skill as a woodsman, marksman, and trapper. Now, though, as he found himself seated in a canoe next to his Umpqua guide and trapper compatriots, Jed Smith was tired. He had come thousands of miles, seen so much, and yet still had not managed to acquire the financial success he had hoped to nearly a decade ago. As the iridescently haunting rays of sunlight began to poke more and more holes in the forest canopy, one can imagine the deep sense of fatigue that must have set in as Smith surmised his current situation in its totality. He and his men were all travel-weary, within striking distance of starvation, and summarily weakened in both body and mind. The preceding days had been worryingly turbulent, and they must have weighed heavily on his mind. He and his men had encountered the Umpqua a few days earlier in a trade meeting that encapsulated the terse, uncertain, and all too human nature of Native and Euro-American interactions spanning from the 1400s to the 21st century. Having spotted some Umpqua sentries at a distance, Smith and his party made signs to parley and initiate trade in hopes of both restoring their supplies and building an amicable relationship. Unlike their Spanish predecessors and American successors, this party of trappers hoped not to conquer or colonize, but merely to peacefully pass through on their way to Fort Vancouver. Even the most ardent extoller of the virtues of manifest destiny among them would concede that now, with a party of not quite 24 objectively overworked and severely undernourished trappers, was not the time nor the place to attempt a conquest of any kind. The Umpqua, who at this point in history rarely saw any white men, were simultaneously wary, curious, and confused. And given even a cursory glance at the territorial geopolitics all along the western coast at the time, but specifically in California and Oregon, it is quite understandable why. Though California had long been ostensibly under the control of the Spanish, the English and the Russians had, at this point, spent decades making forays into the ocean inlets and mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest in hopes of laying claim to its innumerable resources in both flora and fauna. Private interests such as the Hudson Bay Company had also spent small fortunes on incursions deep into the unknowns of the region in hopes of establishing networks of native tribes and collecting intelligence on any potential natural boundaries to be had. In the Treaty of 1818, the United States and Britain, awash in the geocentric hubris of the time, agreed to share exploratory custody of a territory that was not theirs to begin with. Regardless, in the intervening decades, the Umpqua and their neighbors had seen a marked increase in the frequency and size of the expeditionary parties making their incursions into the territory. They had been intermittently accepting of and hostile to such incursions, but in recent months had warmed to the idea of building amicable relations with white traders in hopes of fortifying their own wealth. Jedediah Smith and his party had hoped to capitalize on this, though their interactions with the Umpqua's neighbors to the south had been terse at best and violent at worst up until now. However, seeing the only prudent course of action as taking the most amicable route, Smith intended to make some good trades and build at least some usable amount of rapport with their reluctant, suspicious hosts. The two parties had convened at the mountain men's camp on the west side of the bend in the river. At first, the mood was suspicious. However, after some initial offers and counteroffers, both sides began to relax, and a sense of reserved joviality seemed to prevail. Then, one of the men informed Jedediah Smith that an axe and a skinning knife had gone missing from the party's supplies. It was apparent that, if one of the trappers had not taken the missing items, one of the Umpqua had. Though known for his magnanimity and charity in such situations, Smith had learned through the incessant native thievery that had plagued his party since the Dakotas that no amount of charity would render the goods returned. And so he saw fit to employ more forceful measures. The suspected Umpqua was detained by Smith and two others, tied up and interrogated as to the whereabouts of the axe and knife. For hours, the suspected Umpqua denied any and all knowledge of the missing items. Interestingly, though, even during this time, trading continued amongst a number of smaller parties in which the hungry trappers bartered for shellfish and berries the Umpqua had brought to trade. Finally, though, the axe was found amongst the detained Umpqua's effects, though the knife never was, and he was free. Though he was indeed guilty of the theft, this particular Umpqua was a chief amongst his people, and now felt much aggrieved at his treatment by these American interlopers. He retreated across the river and complained to his fellow chiefs, demanding some kind of retributory action be taken in defense of his honor. The most senior chief in the group dissuaded him from this pursuit, though, arguing that he had not been so egregiously assaulted as to merit the killing of the trappers. However, it would be only a short time later when that same chief, having re-engaged in trading with the trapping party, was himself offended. The two conflicting accounts of what happened next are as follows. In the Umpqua's recounting, the chief in question thought it would be greatly amusing to ride about the camp on one of the fine mounts in possession of the trappers. The trapper who owned the horse ordered him off at gunpoint, and a fight then and there was narrowly avoided. In the trapper's account, the chief was in no uncertain terms directed to dismount, but no kind of firearm was brandished. Despite the disparity in accounts, in either case, an immediate confrontation was avoided. The Umpqua met again across the river and decided that immediate retribution was still not the most prudent answer, and so the auspices of normality with the trappers should be maintained. Hence, the Umpqua who had agreed to guide Smith and his cohorts upriver agreed to stay at the campsite with them in order to leave the next morning. Before his companions left, though, plans were made for exacting the revenge the Umpquas felt to be rightfully theirs. Ostensible agreements were made to resume trading the next day, and the trappers fell into preparing their meals and readying themselves for a night's sleep. Jedediah Smith had his suspicions as to the Umpqua's intent, but could do little more than feign normality and carry on with the evening's tasks. With his small force against the several dozen Umpqua, here in the middle of nowhere, any attempt at an offensive attack would likely result in their small party being overrun. Though there is no record of it, Smith may have conferred with his more senior party members as to the most plausible courses of action. But no determined defensive plan was set in place, nor were the men notified of any suspected heightened threat. However, the next morning, as Smith and company warily paddled their canoe around a bend in the river and out of sight, many in the camp were still asleep. In the succeeding hour or so, many would wake up and begin their morning tasks of checking their equipment and procuring themselves some breakfast before setting about the more laborious tasks of their day. Smith, Leland, and Turner, along with their guide, carried out their intended mission of scouting out a more desirable route to travel. As they made their way back, they paddled with the vigor of men looking forward to a hearty breakfast after a hard morning's work. Then, just as they approached the bend in the river around which they had disappeared earlier that morning, they heard a riotous commotion coming from the camp, still hidden from view. As Smith, Leland, and Turner conferred with each other as to what the cause might be, the Umpqua guide snatched Smith's rifle and in one deft, intentional motion, tipped the canoe over, spilling them all into the river. The Umpqua swam to the western bank, while Smith, Leland, and Turner made it to the eastern bank, just in time to take cover from a volley of fire coming from a hidden group of Umpquas their former canoe mate had swum to for cover. They made their way to the top of a low promontory overlooking their campsite from across the river and were greeted with a scene that must have haunted their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. All of the men in camp were now dead. Only minutes before their arrival, as their friends and comrades were still waking, a force of 200 Umpqua had overrun the camp. Some of the men had been cooking breakfast, some cleaning their weapons, and some were still asleep in their blankets when they were fell upon and cut down in a matter of minutes by Umpqua war clubs, hatchets, and arrows. Smith and company could only watch on as the aftermath unfolded, in which all of their belongings, including furs they had worked 2 years in acquiring, were either stolen or destroyed. Their livestock milled about nervously, made skittish by the sudden commotion and iron scent of blood. Eventually, they too were taken by the Umpqua. One man, Moses Black, had managed to dive into the river and escape his pursuers. According to his later account, he had been cleaning his rifle when 2 Umpqua appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and demanded he relinquish his weapon to them. Black had refused, and after a short tussle, he had turned and ran after being slashed across the back by the Umpqua's knives. He had managed to jump into the river and avoid the arrows and rocks that rained down around him, making it to the eastern bank of the river and escaping. On his flight to the river, he had seen Thomas Virgin being hacked to pieces by a pair of Umpqua warriors, and another trapper, whom he believed to be Thomas Dawes, being chased down by a group of Umpqua in a canoe. Smith, Leland, and Turner, however, had no knowledge of Black's escape, and thus both parties, Smith and company as well as Moses Black, believed themselves to be the sole survivors of the massacre. However, regardless of their communication breakdown, the only viable destination for any trapper lost in that hostile country was to make their way north, as the party had originally intended, to Fort Vancouver. A tortuous hike of roughly 200 miles up rocky shoreline and through unforgiving woodlands that would be incredibly taxing for even fit, well-fed individuals. It would not be until August 8th that Moses Black would struggle to the gates of Fort Vancouver. He was half dead and being nearly carried by a kindly Tillamook native who had taken it upon himself to guide the starving, desperate man to his destination. At first, Black could not bring himself to speak, so shaken were his nerves. The commander of the fort ordered the gates opened and for the clearly traumatized man to be brought in and cared for. After being wrapped in blankets and given a warm drink, Black was able to still his nerves long enough to articulate the horrors of his plight. A retributive excursion was immediately planned by the fort's commander, Captain John McLaughlin. Runners were sent out to the surrounding tribes, notifying them that a handsome reward would be paid to any natives who brought in survivors of the recently perpetrated massacre. The next day at around noon, Smith, Leland, and Turner staggered to the gates of the fort, themselves in little better condition than Moses Black. They too had procured Tillamook guides after making their way roughly 120 miles up the coast. Though both Black and Smith's party were all thrilled to learn that they were not, in fact, the sole survivors of the massacre, their cross-referencing of accounts also confirmed the sad truth that there were no other survivors. This, as in so much of the history of the Old West, is also a matter of some dispute in differing accounts. Umpqua accounts speak of two native women who were traveling with the party and were left unharmed, even eventually marrying into the tribe. Though they were not mentioned in any of Smith's journal entries, nor in the accounts of his contemporaries, that does not mean the Umpqua accounts were untrue. It would not have been uncommon for parties of trappers to provide either employment or safe travel to local tribespeople as their comparatively sizable and well-armed contingent made their way through the territory. However, we do know that every single trapper present, other than Smith, Leland, Turner, and Black, was killed there at the campsite on the Umpqua River. Their names were Thomas Dawes, John Gaither, Abraham LaPlante, Emmanuel Lazarus, Touchant Marichal, Martin McCoy, Joseph Palmer, Peter Ranney, Harrison Rogers, Charles Swift, Thomas Virgin, a former slave known as Ranza, and perhaps most tragically, Marion, the Indian boy whom they had taken into their party, by some accounts forcefully, in order to provide him with either protection, use him for labor, or both. All died tragically violent, terrifying deaths under a dark forest canopy thousands of miles from most of their homes. Smith left only two written accounts of the attack, one to his brother and another to William Clark. Both are relatively terse in nature, and though sorrow is undoubtedly expressed on Smith's behalf, the veneer of his imperturbability remained uncracked. Undoubtedly, though, Smith and the other survivors were all psychologically traumatized and burning for revenge. Smith was informed by a sympathetic Captain McLaughlin that all would be done within his power to restore what property he could of Smith's, but that marshaling an all-out assault on the Umpquas was highly imprudent and thus out of the question. Crestfallen and physically depleted, Smith, Black, Leland, and Turner would eventually recover enough to make their way southeast to the yearly Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming. Smith would eventually make his way back to St. Louis, and after a short-lived retirement from the mountain man life, find himself on the Cimarron River in present-day Kansas. It would be here, in 1831, that Jedediah Smith, legendary mountain man, would meet his end at the hands of the dreaded Comanche. But that, like the plethora of other harrowing stories from Jed Smith's short but remarkable 32-year life, is another story for another time.
Thank you for joining us. If you liked this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to hear more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral,
home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.